Under the shining ceiling of the Hall of Names, young Keth moved quietly between rows of glowing archives, each tablet carved with the names of worlds known to the Council. He was a careful archivist eager to prove himself, and he thought this would be another routine day of cataloging entries when his stylus touched the locked symbol of Earth. The screen trembled, and instead of the usual notes on population and trade, a sealed entry broke open with a single word stamped in red. Last light. The hall filled with the wail of warning sirens, and beams of crimson light flashed across the chamber like bleeding veins across the white stone walls. Keith froze, his breath catching in his throat. The senior archivists rushed to his side. Their eyes, wide with horror, none of them dared touch the tablet again. One elder barked an order to seal the chamber and purge the access logs. But it was too late. The alert had already reached the council chamber far above, and within minutes, a dozen high counselors in long robes arrived. They demanded to know who had opened the file, and when Keith admitted it was him, their eyes softened, not with mercy, but with pity. They said the file was never to be opened because the word Last Light belonged to a time older than the council itself, a word tied to war and endings and powers no one should disturb in another corner of the galaxy. A human linguist named Aisha Khan worked late in her small office in Karachi. She was studying obscure trade dialects when the lights flickered and a knock came at her door. The man who entered was not human. He was tall, thin, with translucent skin and wide, reflective eyes. His voice shook as he said his name was Viel, an envoy of the council. He told her Earth's true name had been discovered and that he needed her help. Aisha asked what name he meant, but Viel refused to say, only that it was a word that frightened even the oldest races, and that if humans were careless, they could bring storms upon themselves and every ally they had made among the stars. When Aisha stepped outside with him, the night was still and filled with city lights, but above the stars seemed too close, too heavy. Viel guided her into a waiting craft, and as they lifted into orbit, she noticed the silence. There were no traders, no music, no chatter of cargo channels. Instead, patrol ships hung in formation around the planet, weapons powered but hidden, their lines hard and sharp against the glow of the Earth. She asked again what word had shaken them so much, but Viel only muttered that it was Last Light, and then grew quiet as if speaking it once had drained him. Back in the Hall of Names, the counselors argued heatedly. Some demanded immediate quarantine of Earth. Others said that would provoke chaos. Still others whispered about old prophecies of a flame that endures when all others fade. The chamber felt less like a hall of reason and more like a nest of frightened birds, all fluttering and colliding with each other. One elder slammed his staff and declared that panic would only prove the word true, and that humanity must be studied, not punished. Another shouted that humanity must be controlled before the word drew enemies from the dark. The session ended with no clear answer, only more fear, and the order that the envoy Viel was to secure cooperation from Earth at any cost. Isha, meanwhile, sat aboard the ship, staring out at her planet as though it had become a stranger. She thought about the myths her grandmother once told her of people keeping small flames alive through storms, of gods who hid the last light of creation in human hearts. She remembered laughing at those stories when she was a child, yet now an alien envoy trembled when he spoke. The same idea. She asked Viel why the council panicked over a word tied to hope and fire, and he finally whispered that hope is dangerous because it cannot be broken by force, and that many powers feared what they could not control. The ship hummed. As it moved toward a silent station in orbit, Aisha realized she had crossed a threshold. There was no returning to the safe world. She had known her life as a quiet scholar was over. Now she was tangled in secrets older than the stars themselves. The word Last Light echoed in her chest, both heavy and bright, like a bell struck in the deep night. And though fear crept into her bones, she also felt a strange pride, for if her people truly carried this hidden name, then perhaps humanity was meant for something more than survival. Perhaps they were meant to carry the flame through every storm. This was only the beginning, and in the council chambers far away, the panic had just begun to spread as the memory of Last Light returned to the galaxy, and all eyes turned toward Earth with dread, and Wondervale's vessel drifted through the cold silence of orbit, its hull gleaming faintly against the glow of Earth below. And inside, Aisha sat across from the envoy, her hands clasped tightly together. Though she tried to hide her unease, Vial was restless, his pale fingers tapping against the smooth surface of the table. He spoke in a voice that carried both caution and urgency. He said the Council had sealed the name of Earth long before humans knew of the stars because last light was never meant to be spoken. It was not a title of honor alone, it was a warning. Aisha frowned and asked him what danger could possibly hide in a name. Vial looked away and said, "A true name binds a world to duties. That cannot be refused, and when the name is spoken aloud, the duty awakens." The vessel soon docked with a neutral station far from the busy trade lanes. Aisha noticed how empty it seemed, corridors echoing with the hum of distant machinery. But no laughter of merchants, no noise of bustling crews. The Council had ordered silence around Earth, and the blockade was not yet declared. But already ships had been warned away, traders who once loved human food, and songs were stranded on the far side. Of the line, rumors spread like wildfire across the dock. Some claimed humans were a hidden war race. Others whispered they were chosen keepers of life itself. And fear made those whispers grow sharper. Aisha walked with Vial through the station and saw aliens she had never met before glancing at her with suspicion. Some pulled their children closer. Others stared with wide eyes as though expecting her to burst into flames at any moment. Vale guided her into a chamber lined with crystal panels. The Council had prepared this room for a private talk away from listening ears. He told her he needed to know what humans remembered of fire myths, of guardians, of ruins, of the last embers. Aisha thought of the stories her grandmother told, and she began to speak in simple words. She told him of how people carried a spark through storms to keep villages warm, how wanderers lit a single lamp in the darkness to guide the lost home. She spoke of hope that endured when kingdoms fell. Vial listened, his eyes shining with something that looked like fear but also longing. He muttered that the Council feared not only strength, but the ability to keep going when strength should have failed. As they spoke, the Council itself argued in chambers of silver high above. Keth stood at the edge of the great table watching the debate spiral. Some counselors shouted that humanity must be contained. Others argued that to move against Earth was to betray the principles the Council had been founded upon. The word last light carried weight none could deny because it had been recorded by a vanished civilization older than all present records, and whenever such a name appeared, it marked a people who would not bend to despair. The more they argued, the more their voices rose until the chamber sounded less like reason and more like panic. On the station, Aisha could feel the weight of that panic pressing down even from afar. She stepped to the viewport and saw patrol ships sliding into tighter orbits, their shadows stretching long across the curve of her planet. She asked Vial why the Council feared so deeply when humans had shown nothing but curiosity and trade. He sighed and said it was because power is not always measured in weapons. Sometimes it is measured in spirit, and when that spirit refuses to yield, it unsettles every empire built on control. He said Last Light was a name given only to those who carried the burden of rebuilding after ruin, and the Council dreaded what that might mean if the galaxy itself was ever to fall into shadow again. Rumors spread faster than orders could be enforced, and soon every corridor of the station buzzed with half-truths. Merchants whispered that humans had secret fleets hidden in the oceans or weapons forged from their own blood. Sailors swore that human songs could stir courage in dying men. The panic turned into both fear and awe, and Aisha felt herself caught in the storm. She turned to Vale and declared that humanity had no such secret fleet, no hidden arsenal. They only had resilience and a stubborn refusal to give up. She said that if the Council feared that, then perhaps it was not humanity's burden to bear, but the Council's weakness that made them tremble. Vial said nothing more. His face unreadable, but his silence told Aisha enough. The galaxy was watching Earth with eyes filled with both dread and hope. And though the humans below went on with their lives unaware of the name uncovered above their world, the tide of history had already shifted, and she could feel that every step she took from this moment would carry not only her own fate, but the weight of her species on her shoulders. The search for truth began when Keith convinced Vial that the panic would only worsen if the Council kept secrets locked away. He argued that fear grew in shadows, and the only way to quiet the storm was to uncover what Last Light truly meant. Vial hesitated, but Aisha stepped forward and supported Keth. Her calm voice cutting through the tension, she said humanity had faced storms before. On Earth, wars, famine, plagues, and still they endured. If the word tied to their world was a burden, then they had the right to know it. Fully Viel finally agreed, and together they boarded a small survey craft, bound for an ancient archive station that had drifted in silence for thousands of years. The station floated at the edge of a dead system, its metal bones wrapped in dust, and its beacon long since extinguished. Many had believed it lifeless. But as the craft drew near, a faint pulse of energy flickered through the lattice of antennas, and a door opened, as if expecting them. The air inside was stale, but breathable corridors, stretched endlessly, lined with murals and inscriptions of a species long gone. Keth translated fragments as they walked, phrases about guardians, about a fire that endures, about chosen worlds that carry the seed of survival. Aisha felt a chill as the words echoed against her grandmother's stories, though these carvings had been made by hands that never touched Earth. Deep within the archive, they found a machine standing on a dais, its surface dull but intact. When they approached, its eyes of amber light blinked open. It spoke in a slow voice like stones grinding together, and it called itself a caretaker, built to preserve memory. It told them that Last Light was not a curse nor a weapon, but a designation granted after a great collapse. Ages passed when whole empires burned. The caretaker said a few worlds had been chosen to bear the duty of carrying life forward through the dark ages, to guard knowledge, seed vaults and forests, and to act when others could not. Those worlds had been rare and their names kept secret so they would not be exploited or destroyed. Isha listened in silence, her heart heavy yet proud. The caretaker revealed records hidden in its core, and holograms shimmered into view, showing small human ships braving storms of radiation and crossing fields of ash to plant forests on shattered colonies. It showed doctors who carried seeds and children across wastelands. It showed artists who taught survivors to sing when they had forgotten hope. The council had never recorded these things because they had been done without glory, without conquest, only with quiet resolve and compassion. Keth studied the records with wide eyes, his voice shaking as he said that humans had been fulfilling the duty without even knowing the title. The caretaker replied that this was the sign of a true bearer of Last Light, for they did not act from pride, but from instinct. They did what was needed to keep the flame alive, and that was why the name carried such weight. It was a reminder that even when all seemed lost, some would continue without demand for recognition. Vale pressed for clarity and asked what else the title granted. The caretaker grew silent before answering. It said, Last Light unlocked defense rights, that no council could deny: the right to resist annihilation, the right to cross borders if survival demanded it, the right to stand against any who would erase life. These rights were ancient and absolute, and though they were meant to protect, they also filled the council with fear, for power that cannot be revoked unsettles every order built by fragile compromise. The machine dimmed after its long speech, its voice fading back into silence, and the chamber fell quiet. Keth felt awe. Aisha felt the burden, and Viel felt dread, yet together they understood that the truth had to be brought back to the council, or the galaxy would drown in lies and panic. Aisha placed her hand against the caretaker's worn surface and promised softly that humanity would not run from its duty. If the word bound them to carry life through storms, then they would carry it proudly. But she also knew the council would not accept this truth easily. As they left the archive station, the stars outside seemed colder, the silence deeper. Yet Aisha felt a spark within her chest, not of fear but of resolve. The name Last Light was not just a label. It was a legacy and a promise. And though the galaxy trembled before it, she felt that humans had been living it all along, even without knowing. And perhaps that was why it frightened the council most of all, because what is done without order or law cannot be controlled. It is simply who they are. When the survey craft returned from the archive station, the air across the galaxy was already thick with unease because fragments of the sealed word had leaked into the trading lanes, and whispers spread faster than any decree of the council. Merchants who once laughed with humans now lowered their voices. When they spoke their names, smugglers passed along half-truths claiming that Earth carried weapons buried under its oceans or hidden fleets in its skies, and frightened citizens believed them because the truth was hidden and fear always filled. The silence. Aisha stepped once more onto her own world and found the streets of Karachi alive with ordinary life. Yet above the skies, bristled with alien patrols that never left, and she realized that humanity was now living under watch, even though few on Earth yet understood it. Keth remained inside the council chambers where debates had grown louder with each passing day. Some elders demanded immediate seizure of Earth's orbital platforms, claiming that such an act would secure peace. Others argued that to chain a last light world was folly, that it would only prove the fear true. But in the corners of those chambers, small groups whispered and planned. They were not guided by wisdom, but by hunger for control. One faction, led by an ambitious counselor named Darren, believed that Earth's rising influence could shatter the balance of the council. He proposed to bring Earth under protective custody and to cloak the move as an act of safety for the galaxy. Vale discovered the outlines of this plan when a coded message slipped into his possession, and he read it with dread. The scheme was brutal in its simplicity. Darren's allies would stage a false incident near Earth where drones disguised as human ships would attack a convoy. The Council would denounce humanity, and in the same breath justify seizing their fleets and their planet under the pretense of order. Vael's loyalty wavered. He was sworn to the Council, yet he could not ignore what he had learned about humanity. Aboard the archive station and in his private talks with Aisha, she embodied not the threat of war, but the stubborn courage of a species that never stopped, even when storms broke every shield. Aisha herself noticed the tightening noose. She walked through her city and saw strangers in alien robes who spoke carefully, but whose eyes measured every word she said. She traveled to the ports and found merchants frustrated and restless, their contracts frozen by suspicion and their ships delayed by endless checks. The blockade was not named, but it had begun. And still her people were unaware of the deeper truth she felt, as if she carried a fire in her chest, that no one around her could see, the knowledge that her world bore the name Last Light, that the council trembled at a word while her neighbors sold fruit in the markets and laughed in the evening light. When Vael came to her with news of the scheme, she did not hesitate. She said, if the council wished to paint humans as aggressors, then the lie had to be broken before the trap was sprung. Keth joined them, though his position was perilous. He smuggled records from the Hall of Names and fragments of testimony from the caretaker machine together. The three formed an unlikely bond of necessity. The archivist, the envoy, and the human scholar, united by truth against the tide of fear. Time was short, because Darren's faction moved swiftly. They deployed drones in secret along the edge of Earth's orbit, disguised with human code stolen from old transmissions. The plan was for those drones to strike a council convoy carrying medical supplies once the attack was seen. The cry for punishment would be deafening, and the council would vote in panic before reason could cool their minds. Aisha listened and felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. But she also felt something else: resolve, the same resolve she had seen in her ancestors' stories of keeping a flame alive through the storm. She told Vael and Keth that if humans were to be tested, then they would stand in the open and not cower behind silence. That night she spoke before a small gathering of traitors stranded on Earth. She told them of the rumors, she told them of the truth as much as she could, speak without proof, and she asked them to stand as witnesses if false charges arose. Many of them were afraid, but some nodded slowly, because they had seen humans risk themselves for strangers in small acts of kindness, and they believed in that memory more than in council decrees. In that moment, Aisha realized the trap might not only be stopped with evidence, but with courage shown openly, so that lies could not root themselves in silence. Above the planet, the disguised drones drifted into, positioned their weapons, armed the faction prepared to strike, and in the shadows Vael, Aisha, and Keth prepared their move. The storm was close, and if they failed, humanity would be marked as traitors before the stars. But if they succeeded, then the council itself would be forced to face its fear and reckon with the meaning of Last Light once more. The storm that the council feared came from an unexpected quarter, for while Darren's faction prepared their false flag assault, another power moved. In the shadows, a pirate lord known as Grath, who had long thrived in the lawless outer systems, saw the chaos growing around Earth and decided the time was perfect to strike. He led a fleet of scavenged warships toward a small moon that belonged to the gentle Avori people, a moon known more for its orchards and scholars than for weapons. Grath believed the council would be too paralyzed by fear of Earth to intervene, and he was right. The chambers rang with endless arguments while the pirate fleet descended like wolves on sheep. News of the raid reached Earth through frightened merchant channels, and Aisha heard the cries of refugees who managed to send broken signals. She looked to Vial and Keth, who both understood what the Council would do nothing for days, perhaps weeks, until endless debate ground toward a decision. And by then, the Evori would be gone. Aisha said firmly that humans would not wait. She gathered a flotilla of small rescue ships. Captained by bold volunteers, many were traders trapped by the blockade who had grown restless. Others were young humans eager to prove that their world was more than a name together. They formed a desperate fleet and set a course for the besieged. When they arrived, the battle was already raging. The pirate ships loomed with crude armor and heavy cannons raining fire upon unarmed villages. But the human flotilla did not hesitate. They broke formation and plunged into the chaos, using speed and improvisation to weave between the enemy barrages. One ship overloaded its engines to ram a blockade runner, buying time for civilians to flee. Another crew used smoke and mirrors to project false targets, drawing fire away from helpless transports. Aisha coordinated the effort with calm fury, guiding captains through the storm of destruction. Her voice steady even as explosions rocked the void around them. The pirates laughed at first, dismissing the human ships as weak and reckless, but their laughter faded when the humans refused to break. Every maneuver seemed born from sheer stubbornness. Each loss answered with another desperate move, and soon the civilians were being evacuated in numbers. Grath himself grew enraged and turned his flagship toward the human flotilla, intending to crush them in a single blow. Yet when his cannons fired, the humans did not scatter. They formed a line of fragile ships blocking the path to the evacuation corridor, their hulls shaking under the blasts, but their resolve unbroken. The sight unnerved even the pirate crews, for it was rare to see prey bare its chest to the predator. In the end, Grath lost his nerve. He saw his ships burning and his enemy refusing to yield. He gave the order to retreat, snarling that it was not worth the cost. His fleet slipped back into the shadows, leaving behind wreckage, but also survivors alive because of human defiance. The Evori, who had been rescued, sent out a broadcast across every channel in the system. They spoke not of soldiers or conquerors, but of human strangers who risked everything to shield them with fragile ships. They told stories of hands that pulled their children from burning domes, of pilots who rammed their vessels into pirate guns, of calm voices that promised them they would not be abandoned. That broadcast spread faster than any rumor, and it reached even the council chambers, where arguments froze mid-sentence as the voices of the saved filled the air. Many counselors shifted uneasily because the image of humans as reckless aggressors could not stand against the living gratitude of those who had been protected. Some still muttered that the act was reckless and dangerous, but the tone had shifted. The galaxy had seen, with its own eyes, that humanity carried the burden of last light, not with pride or threat, but with simple, unyielding courage. Aisha returned to Earth, exhausted her ship, battered, her heart heavy with the weight of lives lost and saved. She stood with Vial and Keth on the landing platform, and for the first time she felt not only fear, but also hope, because the truth was spreading not from decrees or hidden files, but from the voices of ordinary people who had witnessed the flame in action. She whispered that maybe this was what last light meant. Not a title or a secret, but a choice made again and again to stand in the storm, no matter the cost. Yet even as hope grew, Darren's faction did not relent. If anything, the success of the human flotilla hardened their resolve. They saw that compassion could win hearts faster than fear, and that frightened them more than weapons, so they prepared the final phase of their plan. A trap laid not on the edge of distant space, but at the very doorstep of Earth, a test that would either destroy humanity standing forever, or force the Council to admit the truth, that last light was real, and that the flame could not be smothered. The final phase of Darren's plan began in the dead of night, when communications were scrambled and false warnings spread across human networks. Aisha sensed the tension like a tightening coil in her chest. She stood on the observation deck of the orbital station above Earth, watching the stars flicker with distant lights and knowing that some of them hid ships armed not for diplomacy, but for deception. Vale's fingers hovered over controls as he attempted to trace the sources of the alerts, while Keth deciphered fragments of data pulled from the Council's encrypted channels. They realized that the attack would be immediate, precise, and crafted to look like a human provocation, designed to force retaliation and give Darren the justification to strike first. Aisha convened the human leaders. Aboard the station quickly, they gathered pilots, engineers, and captains of cargo fleets turned soldiers in moments of necessity. She spoke to them calmly, yet with fire, telling them that this would be the defining hour of their species, not for glory or conquest, but for the right to exist and to prove the galaxy that humans bore. Last light not as a threat, but as a promise. Her words spread quickly, and every ship prepared with renewed determination. The silence of space seemed heavier than ever, the weight of centuries pressing down on the shoulders of those who would answer fear with courage. As the false flag flotilla approached Earth's orbit, sensors picked up the exact formation the Council had predicted, but Aisha was ready. She had ordered her ships to scatter and regroup behind the asteroid belt to create shadows that would hide their true numbers, while smaller vessels slipped past scanners planting decoys and holographic images that tricked the enemy into believing that the human fleet was fragmented and weak. Vielle guided the coordination from the bridge, each signal carefully timed, each maneuver designed to confuse and disorient the attackers. The human fleet became a living trap, a maze of shadows and reflections, moving like a single entity without hesitation. The moment of contact arrived and the enemy opened fire, but the humans did not scatter. They twisted and danced between blasts, their engines pushing beyond normal limits, their shields absorbing strikes that should have destroyed them. Keth watched the data streams from the archive feeds and whispered that humanity had always done this instinctively, that it was in their nature to survive. Even when all odds said otherwise, the Council observers, monitoring the exchange from afar, could hardly believe their instruments. The humans were using ingenuity and daring, not overwhelming firepower, to counter the threat, and each act of bravery undermined the narrative Darren sought to construct. Aisha personally led a squadron through the densest part of the enemy formation, her ship slicing between turrets, dodging energy beams, while small transports carrying civilians and essential resources moved unharmed behind them. She coordinated with crews who risked themselves to shield others, and as the hours stretched, the enemy began to falter. Confusion spreading among their ranks. Grath's former pirates, who had once feared humanity, now whispered tales of daring and impossible maneuvers. Seeing the humans act not with malice but with focus and protectiveness, the fleet broke apart, sending scattered ships retreating into deep space. When the dust of the engagement settled, the human fleet remained intact, though battered. The orbital stations above Earth had survived the assault, civilians and traders safe, because courage had guided the fleet rather than hatred, and the Council itself could not ignore the broadcast feeds from the battle. Even the most conservative voices could not deny the evidence, every transmission showing humans saving lives, outmaneuvering threats, and standing resolute against overwhelming danger. Aisha realized that Last Light had been proven not with proclamations, but with action, that the galaxy had witnessed what humans were willing to do when survival and duty were intertwined. Darren's plan collapsed under the weight of its own deceit. The false evidence could not stand against the reality of human courage and ingenuity. His faction fractured as Council members demanded investigation into the conspiracy, and Vale worked tirelessly to secure every recording and testimony, while Keth ensured that the archive's knowledge of Earth's true name and history was safeguarded for transparency and accountability. The humans had forced the Council to confront truth, and for the first time the word Last Light was spoken in chambers, not with fear, but with grudging respect. Aisha returned to Earth feeling a weight lift from her shoulders, yet knowing that the path forward would be fraught with political machinations and hidden threats. She walked among her people whose lives had gone on unaware of the near calamities in orbit, but who now lived in the shadow of a rising legend of human courage. She whispered to Vale and Keth that the name Last Light was no longer just a burden. It was a mantle to be carried with pride, a reminder that humanity's instinct to endure, to protect, and to act without expectation of recognition was a force beyond control, and that those who underestimated it did so at their peril. The galaxy had witnessed what it meant to bear Last Light, and the Council would forever be changed, not by decrees or fear, but by the living proof that humanity had always been the flame that could not be extinguished. The Council chambers were in chaos as the final reports reached the delegates, every screen filled with the unmistakable images of humans moving with precision and daring across space, their small vessels weaving through orbital debris and enemy fire, while civilians were shepherded to safety. and no human ship had fired a single shot in aggression. Yet the outcome was undeniable. The humans had turned the Council's plan on its head, exposed the deception of Darren's faction, and forced every member to confront the reality of Last Light in action. Whispers became shouts, accusations were hurled not at humanity, but at those who had sought to manipulate fear into power. Isha stood aboard the orbital station, her eyes tracing the outlines of Earth below its oceans glinting under the sunlight and cities alive with ordinary lives, unaware of how close they had come to becoming pawns in a galactic scheme. She felt the pulse of her planet, as if it were a living thing, and in that moment she understood that Last Light was more than a name or a secret. It was resilience embodied. It was courage that acted without expectation. And she realized that humans carried it naturally, because it had been forged. In the fires of survival, from the first steps taken across harsh landscapes to the first settlements under stormy skies, Vale monitored the communications from the Council, noting the shifts in tone from panic to grudging respect. The records of human ingenuity and bravery could not be denied even by the most conservative delegates. And as debates raged, it became clear that Darren's faction had lost authority. There, plans unraveling under scrutiny and the evidence collected by Kath, Vile and Aisha presented not only the truth of the attack, but also the proof that humans were capable of operating beyond conventional expectations of any species the Council had ever dealt with. Earth's fleets, though still modest, had become symbols of defiance and ingenuity. The ships that had once been simple merchant vessels were now legends, each captain a hero not for conquest, but for protecting others. Every maneuver recorded and transmitted to the Council showed a species willing to risk everything to uphold life and truth, and in every corner of the galaxy. Beings whispered that if humans could act with such resolve in the face of deceit and overwhelming danger, then perhaps it was no surprise that their name inspired both fear and admiration. Darren himself was brought before the Council under investigation. His schemes laid bare and his ambitions curtailed. He argued that humans were unpredictable, dangerous, and untrustworthy. Yet the evidence proved otherwise. Every act of humanity had been guided not by malice but by necessity and courage. And when the Council finally deliberated, they recognized that Last Light was not a threat to be controlled, but a force to be acknowledged, that humans, when cornered or challenged, acted with clarity, precision, and unwavering intent, that to underestimate them was folly, and to suppress them would invite disaster. Aisha returned to the surface of Earth, greeted by the cheers and laughter of her people who sensed, even if not fully understood, that something had shifted in the stars above. Humans no longer hid in the shadows of rumor and fear. They had acted openly, boldly, and without hesitation, and the galaxy had seen it. She walked among markets and ports, speaking quietly to those she met, reminding them that courage was not loud or boastful, but constant, steady, and that in every choice to protect, to act, to endure, they carried the mantle of Last Light with pride. Vale and Keth stood beside her as the Council broadcasts reached every corner of the system. Humans were now discussed with awe and careful respect, their deeds no longer rumors or threats, but undeniable records of what a determined species could accomplish under pressure. And the Pambor trio knew that the galaxy would never again look upon Earth and its people with casual dismissiveness. The name Last Light would inspire calculation, caution, and in some, the desire to understand rather than to dominate. And so humanity remained vigilant yet unbowed, ordinary lives continuing beneath extraordinary skies. Their ordinary acts now extraordinary because the galaxy had witnessed them in motion. They had acted without expectation of reward, without fear of reprisal. And the legend of Last Light was cemented in fact and in spirit. The Council itself, forced to reckon with truth, began to change its decrees not from fear, but from the knowledge that some forces, some species, could not be controlled. Only respected Aisha looked up at the night sky, stars stretching infinitely, and whispered that humanity had survived not because of weapons, not because of cunning, but because they had chosen to act with courage to protect what they could, to stand in the storm, to be the flame in darkness, to embody Last Light. And the galaxy would remember. The galaxy had grown quiet in the wake of humanity's defiance. Whispers of Last Light traveled faster than any fleet, faster than any Council decree. Every being who had watched the events unfold felt the weight of what they had seen. Humans had moved through fire and shadow without hesitation. They had saved lives, protected the weak, and stood unbroken against fleets far larger and more dangerous than their own. Aisha walked among her people, on earth, feeling the pulse of life beneath her feet, knowing that every choice they had made carried the echo of courage that no deception could suppress. No threat could extinguish the flame of last light that humans bore naturally, as if it were carved into their very bones. Veil, and Keth stood beside her on the observation platform, watching the stars twinkle in the void, knowing that the galaxy would never see humans the same way again. Every pilot, engineer, and civilian who had acted in the great trials had woven themselves into a story that would be told for centuries. A story not of conquest, but of protection. Not of glory, but of steadfastness. Not of fear, but of unwavering intent. The humans had become living proof that courage and ingenuity could defy expectation and bend reality without the need for weapons or threats. They had simply acted with resolve. Across the council chambers, debates raged. Still, some voices called for caution, some for understanding, but none could deny the truth that humans had shown themselves to be unpredictable and extraordinary in the ways that mattered most. They had acted without malice, without pretense, without the expectation of reward, simply because it was right to do so. And as each record of their deeds streamed into every system, the name Last Light became more than legend. It became a symbol, a reminder that some forces could not be contained, some species could not be dismissed, that humanity was a spark that refused to die on the surface of Earth. Celebrations were quiet in some places and loud in others, but everywhere there was a sense of something new, a sense of potential realized and responsibility embraced. Aisha looked at the horizon, at the cities and forests and oceans bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. She knew that this was only the beginning, that humanity would face trials, yet greater dangers, yet more cunning enemies, but they had learned that together they could act with clarity, courage, and unyielding intent, and that the galaxy would always remember the name Last Light not as a threat, not as a secret, but as proof of what humans could achieve when they chose to stand. The night sky seemed to stretch infinitely above them, and Aisha whispered to Vale and Keth that the story of Last Light was theirs to carry, theirs to protect, theirs to pass on to generations who would live and die under stars that had witnessed humanity's courage, and they understood that this was more than victory. It was a legacy, a promise that humans would endure, adapt, survive, and shine wherever the universe might cast them. And so the galaxy held its breath and remembered, and humanity stood tall and unbroken, a species defined not by fear, not by conquest, but by the flame of Last Light burning in every choice, every act, and every heart. The end